Hi, I'm James Everingham, and I'm the producer of Royal Albert Hall Organ. In this video, I want to take a bit more of a detailed look at the technical side of the library. If you haven't already seen my first look video, I definitely recommend checking that one out first so you can really hear what this thing sounds like. Whereas here, we're going to use a little bit more jargon and explore all the features you might be using as a professional composer or producer. I have it loaded up here, so let's dive straight in with what you see when you open up Royal Albert Hall Organ for the first time, which is the mixer page. So if I go from left to right, the first fader we see here is the JE mix position. Now this isn't a mix in the sense of it being a sum of these individual mics, but rather it's my personal interpretation, hence the initials, of everything we have in the hall as a stereo option. And we had over 20 mics from way back up in the gallery to right in front of the pipes themselves and everything in between. We actually went up in the roof and rigged the drops so we could get all the mics exactly where we wanted them. And I felt it was important to steer away from over-processing with this stereo mix. I wanted to leave those bigger decisions down to the user. So this is primarily a balancing of my favorite mics with some considered EQ, some subharmonic synthesis on the LFE mic, just really offering an accurate portrayal of the way it sounds in the room. So here's what that sounds like. Tail of this room is just amazing. It's been something I've been trying to achieve for a very long time. Just this sort of grandiose release that you get from the final chord of something like a Mahler symphony. You can only really get it from a room like the Royal Albert Hall. It's physically huge, but also just so synonymous with these iconic classical performances. So it's a massive privilege to be able to record in that space and capture that. So this mix position is what you're going to want to use if, say, you're running this on a laptop and you want to keep resource usage low. You're getting the full mix of the organ in the hall without loading more than one mic position into your RAM. Now, a few items that apply to every mic, every fader, are these solo and mute buttons. And if you're configured for multiple outputs, you can change the output of each mic position here with this arrow. If you want to unload a mic position, there are two ways to do this. You can click here, or if you have this ticked in settings, you can drag the fader all the way down to automatically turn off and unload the mic position. We also have the mics override mix setting, and this means if you have my stereo mix active and you load an individual microphone, the mix will be automatically switched off and vice versa. Moving on to the Royal mic position. Now this is a Neumann KU100 binaural microphone we chose to place in the Royal box, which offers a highly accurate representation of being there in the room. The box happens to be positioned in a great location acoustically, so it's a helpful mix reference point to come back to as well. Another application for this mic could be source audio in film and TV. Let's say you're writing some music for a scene set in a cathedral, and this would be the mic to go to for the most authentic, raw sound as heard in real life. Here's what that sounds like. Now we have the individual mic positions. These are 4 mics I selected out of everything we had in the hall as offering good diversity of depth into the hall and tonal character without compromising too much hard drive space. So we have left and right, center, gods, and surrounds. Starting with the left, right, and center, it's perhaps a little unconventional to include a mono center mic separately. And the reason we've done this is that the organ is massive. It's basically a whole wall that extends far behind the facade and projects sound from a variety of locations depending on the pipes that are sounding. And if you look at the organ from the front, you have these 3 main openings. So it made sense to have a mic right in the middle that sort of fills the gap between the extreme width of the left and right mics. To demonstrate this best, I'm going to load up the principal diapasons registration. And you'll hear if I play a chord with just the left and right mics, and then slowly introduce the center mic, you'll hear it adds some really nice presence, particularly so on patches that have pipes sounding from the center area of the organ. Now the gods are pretty much on the highest gallery level, but just a little further into the hall from the stage, so sort of in the wings, but up high, capturing all that energy from the top of the organ. And the surrounds are at the very, very rear of the hall on each side. It's worth mentioning now that if you put, say, a trumpet on the stage and put a mic up close and a mic at the back of the hall, you're going to get quite a dry, focused sound from the close mic and a much more washed out mellow timbre from the far mic. And this is obviously the case with the organ as well, but we found that there was much less of a timbral shift on the other side of the hall, just because of the insane size of the organ and the volume that it puts out. And in fact, what gives the surround mics much of the size is the physical delay between the sound hitting the mics up close and the surround mics, 70 meters away at the back of the hall. And we can feel that delay as we play the surround mics soloed. For scenarios in which you want to counter this, we can use the room mic align fader here in settings to shift the transients of the gods and surround mics so that they align with the transients of the LCR, and in doing so you'll lose some of the size perception but gain playability. Now, some pipes in the organ are what we refer to as enclosed, and these are pipes behind mechanical shutters that open and close, controlled from the console by swell pedals. And they alter primarily the tone of the sound, kind of taking the edge off and offering the organist some real-time dynamic control. So if I just grab a different registration, perhaps strings flatando, and adjust the swell here, we can hear that it's reflected in the library as well, and by default is assigned to CC1, which for me is the mod wheel on my keyboard here. And expression is pretty much what it says on the tin. It uses volume to give you that extra little bit of dynamic control. And by default, this is on CC11. These are both MIDI faders, so you can right-click and assign to whatever you like. Now, when you're playing a real organ, you're playing the manuals or the keyboards with your hands, obviously, and you're playing the pedal board with your feet. So something I spent a great deal of time thinking about was how we could translate that multi-limb experience into something playable on, for most people, a single MIDI controller or keyboard. And what I settled on was this idea of left hand and right hand. It's what we have available, and this will make a little more sense in a minute when we take a look at the keyboard page. But here on the mixer, we do have separate volumes for the left hand and the right hand. And then down below, we have two slots where we can load in a sound, a registration, or as we call it in the world of sample libraries, a patch. So here on the right-hand slot, we have the browser, where we can choose out of all the available patches what we want to load onto the right hand. So maybe a classical organ. And then we can do the same for the left hand, and here we'll go with the pedals registration, chamber woods. You can also tag your favorite patches like this. Now we can hear how classical organ and chamber woods are split across the keyboard for the left and right hands. And by default, when we have a manuals registration and a pedals registration loaded, we get pretty much an octave of overlap. The other main use case here would be to have a solo loaded for the right hand and a manual loaded for the left hand. Solos in this case are single stops from the solo and solo bombard divisions that are typically performed more like obviously solos and more exposed lines. So if we choose one for the right hand, let's go with Tuba Mirabilis, and a manual for the left hand, go with Nimrod Swell, we can head over to the keyboard page and see how these two patches are mapped. And because we have a solo stop and a manuals registration, this is automatically split in the middle so that we can keep those lower octaves for chords on the manuals and higher octaves for a melody on the solo. And this is all customizable as well, so we can grab the handles for the left and right hands and move their ranges like this, or we can shift them up and down by octave. And then if we want to start over, we can reset all this to default like that. If we turn on external MIDI mode, this will unlock setting the MIDI input channels for left and right hands individually. And as the prompt mentions here, just be sure to set your Kontakt instance to Omni for this scenario. So if you do have an electric organ and you can send each manual out on a separate MIDI channel, this would be the way to go. You could even do this with just multiple MIDI piano keyboards for a slightly more authentic playing experience. What I've done is taken my favorite combinations of left hand and right hand patches and saved them into the snapshots here. So for all of these, we have two patches that complement each other, and then obviously you can save your own as well. I'm just going to go back to Voice of Jupiter for now. We can see this sets up the patch selection for each hand and the balance if applicable. Now something else we can do is view which stops are used for each patch via the browser here. We click View Stop List. And in organ terminology, a combination of stops in this sense is called a registration. And if we look along the top here, we can see the different divisions of the organ, and we can scroll through and see which stops are active for Voice of Jupiter, which we have loaded at the moment. This could be useful if you're looking to configure a real organ with what you're using in this sample library, since many stops and kinds of stops are common between pipe organs. And it's worth noting that the numbers here signify the longest pipe for that stop in feet. So when we're using 8-foot stops, and that actually means the middle C is sort of equivalent to middle C on a piano in terms of pitch. So that's another way you can kind of see the range and timbre for the active patch. On the settings page, we have our common round robin controls. We can reset the round robins either on transport or on a key switch, and also have the option to turn them off altogether. Something I haven't mentioned yet is the dynamic attack, and at its core, this is a staccato overlay, but I spent a lot of time dialing in the relationship between the sustains and the staccatos to offer the most playable version of what the organ sounds like in the room. So I'd recommend leaving this turned on, unless perhaps you're playing particularly slowly and elegantly. Now the sample start control determines how far into the samples you are when we press the keys. For example, if you're playing long chords or legato melodies, you might want an earlier sample start. You might want a tighter sample start if you're playing fast, sharp passages. So it could be adjusted to taste depending on your playing style. I'm just going to reset to default with Control-click here. We can do this for all the parameters. I think it's worth mentioning that the organ is arguably more of a wind instrument than it is a keyboard instrument. This means that higher notes, so smaller pipes, will sound more immediately than lower notes, which are bigger pipes and require more air to sound. So in the lower octaves, you can really feel the slower attack of the wind being pushed through these colossal pipes to create a tone. I think this is where you can really feel the visceral power of what's physically happening inside the organ to generate these huge sounds. So something else to consider with the sample start is just the literal distance between the organ console, the keyboard, and some of the pipes. So for a patch like classical organ, I just load that up now, you're utilizing pipes quite close to the front of the organ, so you're getting a much more immediate response than a sound like corno di bassetto, whose pipes are housed upstairs, right at the back of the organ in a separate room, really. So in real life, there's that same delay between the pipes themselves producing sound and that sound physically reaching your ears at the console or in the auditorium. So if you're noticing that discrepancy between patches, that's why. And if you want to change that for playability, you can do that with the sample start control. With stereo width, all the way down to the left, we'll bring everything down to mono. And as we move it to the right, we're introducing some subtle stereo spread. Presence. Now, because we presented the mics raw in terms of effects processing, and because I kept the mixed position relatively subtle, I wanted to include a way to easily introduce some presence and color to the sound to really bring it to the forefront of the mix. So for this, we have the presence control. And under the hood, this is some very subtle tube compression, some saturation, and some top-end enhancement. And we hear as I increase the presence amount, it really starts to come forwards and lift off. I like to leave it somewhere around the halfway mark. We also have a built-in convolution reverb. So we have our wet and dry control here. And we can actually load in custom impulse responses, which once you've dropped in your install and reloaded the instrument will appear in this drop down here. Now the raw Albert Hall is already very large, so I tend to leave this off by default, but it's here if this makes sense for you in context. Maybe you're using this for live performance in a church perhaps, you might want to add your own reverb right here in Kontakt. If we take a look at the library browser in Kontakt, we've been looking at the Raw Albert Hall organ master patch here, but we also have the manuals, pedals, and solos split out as individual patches. And these are a little lighter on resources, so make a little bit more sense if perhaps you're loading a bunch of sounds into a Vienna ensemble workflow or something like that. We also have some additional effects and percussion, which I explore a little more in my first look video. It's funny to think of, 150 years ago constructing the Royal Albert Hall and its organ. They never would have imagined that now, essentially anyone can play it wherever they are. Having been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with the real thing, I think we've really managed to capture that feeling you get in the room itself with authenticity. So hopefully this has been helpful from a technical perspective. There's a lot more info on our website, so do check that out. And as I said before, if you haven't watched my first look video, it's definitely worth a watch where we get to explore the sounds and hear that in practice a little bit further. We also have a video with the amazing organist, Richard Hills, explaining the organ from the console in the hall itself. So do check those out. The links will all be in the description below. Thanks very much for watching.